This morning, we're very happy to have Mary Jo Vollmer-Sandholm with us. She will be talking about toxic stress and resilience, a gospel therapy. She is a research fellow, a lecturer, and specialist in forensic medicine and prevention. So over to you, Mary Jo, and welcome.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen here. Just checked that it does indeed work. So if I can find it again now, there it is. Thank you so much for having me, letting me come and share a little bit about my experience. As you mentioned, I do work at Oslo University Hospital, and I have worked with I sometimes have to switch back into just speaking English because professionally I work in Norwegian. So I work in forensic medicine, and I have worked in this and social pediatrics, and I've worked in these fields for 20 years. And I'm going to tell a little bit of a story about how I got to the point where I care so much about where this fits into my faith, and how I think that we as a church can make such a big difference. So I thought I would start by saying I was seeing patients at a clinic in Southern California, actually, and I kept having patients that came in from religious backgrounds. And it was troubling me because so much of the abuse was happening in church settings or synagogue or mosque. And I asked my colleagues, are you also having a lot of these cases? And they said, no, they weren't. And so then one day, usually when I have a lot of things happening at the same time like that, I wonder, is God trying to tell me something? Is he trying to show me something? And so I decided that I would keep my eyes a little more open. And not long after that at church, someone approached me and said, I need you to see something. They knew what field I worked in. And they brought me over and pointed out a dad who was standing over his son yelling, and he was stamping on his son's feet as he grabbed him by the shoulders. And he was yelling, I don't care about you. I don't care about your Sabbath school. If you don't cooperate now, you're going to wish you were dead when you got home. So I went to one of our pastors and I just said, hey, I just saw this and I'm worried about this family. And this is what I witnessed. And the response I got was, well, how am I supposed to know who that is? And I said, well, I saw that the dad was in your Sabbath school class. So, and I tried, and he's like, no, how would I know who that is? I don't know. And there was just no interest whatsoever. And I, then went and talked to some other people, but it just seemed like it wasn't really maybe taken seriously. And I'm afraid to say I let it go at that point, believing I had handed it off. But a few weeks later, a couple months later, I was seeing patients in the clinic and I got a call from Children and Family Services saying, we have an emergency patient. Can we bring him in? I said, sure. But when I went out to get his chart and looked through the glass, it was the same little boy. Of course, there's a conflict of interest. I knew who the family was. So I called in a clinician from another clinic and they came over and saw him, but he was covered in injuries. A teacher at his Adventist school had seen some of the injuries and had called Children and Family Services. But as I saw that child being taken by Children and Family Services, and as I heard the police talking about going to arrest the dad, and as I saw the mom, thankfully, she didn't see me, so she didn't know anyone new, but she came and got their beautiful car and drove it home because of the dad being arrested. It just struck me, where did God show up in their story? Did he show up in their story? Where is he in this? And thankfully, the church I went to took it very seriously. But I wondered, isn't that where we are Jesus' hands and feet? It's where we are his heart. It is in people's messiness. It's in everywhere that they struggle. So it was kind of an inspiring time. And when I look back, I'm so thankful in a way that pastor said what he said, because it lit a fire under me and it made me realize that I had to do something. And that's when we started with the North American division, the End It Now efforts. And I think God always uses, even where we drop the ball, he can use those for good things. So I wanted to just talk a little bit in the context of faith and church and our own situations about what toxic stress is. It's a field that has just exploded. Actually, before I go further, I wanted to pray after that story. So dear Jesus, I just pray that today you will be in our gathering, and that you will, you know, the hearts and lives of every person here, and you know exactly what they need, and you can meet them right where they are. So I pray that you would guide my words and open our hearts to hearing what you want to say. In your name, amen. So in my work, I obviously confront a lot of situations of toxic stress. And I have also worked in general pediatrics, so I am familiar with the fact that everyone actually can benefit from some stress in their lives. So if kids grow up with no adversity whatsoever, and they never so much as lose a pet rabbit or a grandparent, then it's much harder for them to know how to deal with life stressors. And that's true for all of us. It can be motivating. A little stress can be a great thing. But when does it cross over to toxic stress? And so we'll talk a little bit about causes, a shame connection, signs and symptoms of toxic stress, like what we can be looking for in ourselves. And why does it matter? Like, what are the outcomes with toxic stress? Because those are maybe more serious than we know. And then also a little bit about where does Jesus fit into the picture? Where was he going to show up for my family that I described? But I wanted to start with what toxic stress feels like. So, and what I'm talking about today, I realize can be triggering for some of you, because some of you have either experienced a lot of toxic stress, or you have toxic stress in your life right now, or you as a child experienced a lot. So I just want to speak to those of you who are in that situation. If you need to take a break, if you need to go talk to someone, just make sure you take care of yourself in this process, because it can be triggering. But for those of you who are able, I'd like you to remember the last time you felt really scared. Like, can you remember a time when you maybe thought that your child had been injured or hurt, or you thought you were losing a primary relationship? You were in a big fight with someone. Maybe you lost your job or thought you would. Maybe you had to fire someone, and that was really scary. But the last time you felt real fear, you know, your heart races, your pupils dilate, your heart pounds, maybe your jaw tightened. What causes those responses in your body is our hypopituitary adrenal axis. The amygdala in our brain says, it's a crisis, it's dangerous, and they activate that whole system. And again, this can be really helpful if you're meeting a bear in the forest. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, so this can be like really helpful if you're meeting a bear in the forest, right? Because it's like danger, danger. And this epinephrine, these stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, they really get you ready for fight or flight or freeze, right? And those things are really, it's a God-given gift that we have those abilities. But if that's happening over time, if you're finding that you're having that tummy ache, you're finding that tightness in your chest, you're finding that heart pounding, jaw tightening stress, over time, that is what we call toxic stress. And it is something that often happens if it's something that we haven't been getting the support we need, or it's something that is chronic over time. So again, some stress is good, you know, it can really help us. But when it becomes a toxic stress, has generally been researched from childhood. And I'll tell you about that story in a minute. But we also know that we're very familiar with this research from soldiers who have been deployed and have PTSD. So it's kind of the same mechanism if you're familiar with that. But this is where toxic stress is, where it's severe, prolonged, it's repetitive, and it actually changes your neuroendocrine system over time. And it's really important to pay attention to, because it's been researched to show that it changes the whole trajectory of our lives. And again, like Adventists, we have the coolest health message, but to me, it's often been cooked down into kind of this shoulds and should nots. And the rest of the world is now like looking at the same things I grew up with and going, hey, these are really important. These can really help with toxic stress. And I'm like, I know, but we have never marketed it that way. We haven't made it exciting and fun and new, and it actually is. If we follow science, like I think we should, everything can become fresh and interesting again. But I want to use some examples before I get to how we started to research this, or how other people did years ago. I thought I would talk about what toxic stress might look like for some of you. I already asked you to think about how stress feels, but I think some typical examples can be in pastors or church workers. It can show up in burnout when it is over time, these chronic problems, maybe a congregation that's chronically at war, or office stresses where you just are having a hard time being all on the same team. We all know that the world church has been really struggling and very split. And that stress over time, trying to find out where you stand and then trying to bring people together, that can be really hard. And for those of us who've grown up in religious communities, in the faith, very often we have a lot of shame layers. And recognizing that shame is crucial to being healthy emotionally and spiritually, and then eventually physically. And I'll mention that in a little bit too. But those unmet expectations and that dialogue that we have, that internal dialogue, if you really stop and listen, is it the voice of truth and peace and love, the voice of God that you hear most often? Have you ever stopped to really listen? Or is it this taskmaster of, why are my numbers not what I wish? Is my congregation or my office in the state in which it is? These are, personal goals. We walking as Christians, sometimes I look at my colleagues, most of which are complete humanistic or atheist, and they sometimes have such a freer, happier, more joyful life than I have in the past. I think I'm getting there more, but I've just realized their expectations of themselves, especially, are so much less. They feel, again, much more peace. And that is what God has promised me. So where have I gone wrong on that path? I've asked myself, but even the way I frame that question can be very shaming. But your own personal, if you're fighting with a lust addiction, especially for church workers, we carry so many secrets, because how do you as a pastor or a leader of a division tell your next person beside you, I have a porn addiction? That's like super hard. How do you tell someone that you have an anger problem, that you're constantly snapping your husband's head off, or whatever it is? We as Christians are living with these expectations of ourselves, and we have a really hard time being honest with others. But what the research shows, and I will get to this even more, is that secrets are dangerous. And if you're walking around with heavy expectations and heavy secrets about yourself that maybe you can hardly admit to yourself, it's very damaging to your health. We can talk all day about we don't smoke and we don't drink and whatever else, but if you're carrying around toxic stress, you may be missing the point. And then professionally, maybe some of you have had goals that you haven't been reaching. What are you telling yourself about that? And then spiritually with God, I mean, there's nothing harder than being a church worker and feeling like you're struggling spiritually. What a fake you are, right? But if you think about how that is causing over time, if you're letting that chip away at you, some of that toxic stress, take that seriously. And then doubt, of course, that's really hard. I've been listening to a sermon on doubt. Like I've listened to it, I think 4 times now, and I love it so much. I think sometimes we've missed the point that doubt is a beautiful thing, right? It's a struggle with God. And I would so rather, if I'm in a relationship with you, that you're honest with me about things you wonder about me and things that don't make sense. And I think God loves to meet us there. So all of these layers, all of this toxic shame, we have to pay attention to. And again, some of this is healthy. Some of this we are arm wrestling with God, and some of it we definitely, well, all of it we want to pay attention to. But it's just at what level has it reached in our lives, and then in the lives of our patients, right? Because what happened with Dr. Felitti, he was a preventative medicine specialist in San Diego in the 1990s. And so he's working all with health issues in his patients, mainly with obesity. And he had a patient who was she's like his model patient. And he was so proud of her. She had lost tons of weight, had gastric bypass surgery, and was fit and healthy and beautiful. And yet one day she called him and she said, Dr. Felitti, I just need you to know, I could tell you cared, and I don't want you to find out another way than from me that I'm going to kill myself. And he was like, wait, what? And she said, yes, you don't get it. She said, I was sexually abused as a child, and food has been my comfort. It's how I cope. And my fat is my safety. And they're both gone, and I can't live like this. And Dr. Felitti realized in that moment that he had been missing the whole point. He was trying to make her thin, but he wasn't seeing what was in her heart, what was in her life, and what she actually needed. And what I love about him is he always wanted to go deeper and see what his patients really needed. And I would just challenge those of us who are in the church, as long as we are going up and saying really smart things from the pulpit and putting in place really cool programs, but we're not really starting with ourselves, getting into our own hearts, and starting with meeting people where they are in their messes, because most of us have been or are in some messes, then we're missing the point. So Dr. Felitti changed everything he was doing, and he was very hated for it. But he started asking, like his colleagues said, you can't do it. And he said, watch me. And he hired they said, you can't start asking all your patients about their adverse childhood experiences, but he did. And he hired a psychologist with a pager so that he could get in touch with her if any of his patients freaked out being asked questions about this. But he told me, I interviewed him for a film, and he said, I have stacks, like folders. He's made binders of letters from patients saying, thank you for asking me. I thought I would carry the secret to my grave. And he saw 30% reduction in sick visits the next year. And I said, why do you think they were sick less often? And he said, we've equated it to the Catholic Church and confession. That when you can sit in front of someone and tell them your deepest secrets, and you're safe and you're accepted, it's healing. And I think, how many of us carry secrets that we need to be healed from? How many people in the Adventist church trying to be perfect, trying to reach these expectations that we think God or others hold over us? How many of us are slowly dying? We're living this toxic stress. And we, within our church, I don't know, I was going to bring it up earlier, but I'll mention it here. My dad is a pastor, and I have loved seeing, he knows all of his church members so personally. He visits them all regularly. He takes them to breakfast. Just growing up, everyone was a member of our family. If my dad wasn't there, they wanted to talk to me, much to my frustration as a teenager, especially the very chatty ones. But, if we're not reaching people's hearts, whether they're your employees or they're your church members or whoever, if you don't really know them. And Brene Brown is this researcher who is like at the head of this helm of saying, we as leaders have to love our people. And she's, she is a Christian, but she's not coming from that posture, but I think we as a church have to be taking the lead on some of this, that there is too much research. We know too much. So what is our goal? What is our end goal here? We want healthy people, and that's why we come with this health message. And in some churches, we won't even baptize until they don't drink alcohol anymore, they don't smoke anymore, but yet toxic stress changes their whole body. And this is what's been researched. I'm not going to go into these. This is just a snapshot of saying this is where the research started. Is Dr. Felici, who I just mentioned. He discovered that these adverse childhood experiences change forever who we become. He studied 17,000 middle-class Americans, but we've studied it extensively in Norway, and it's been studied in every other developing country I know of. And what we know is people who've experienced these things, they die an average of 20 years earlier if they do not get help, if they've had 6 or more of these. So again, we as a church have a huge opportunity to integrate into our health message the fact that not only are our current health principles a huge solution to some of these stressors, as I'll show in a moment, but also that these stressors are existing every bit as much or more. We have more domestic violence, more intimate partner violence in our church than outside. How much, some of us are addressing it, and it's great, but we have so many opportunities. So I'll come back another time and go more into detail if anyone's interested. But what we know is that when people experience adverse childhood experiences or toxic stress, they have so much, their whole body systems change. And it's kind of because of the stress hormones I talked about. And it's not just that they're depressed, they have more cancer, more diabetes, and they are jobless. They really struggle in life in general. And as I said, they'll die an average of 20 years earlier. Here's just more of illustrations of some of the things that they struggle with. And this was a shocker to the researchers, but now since 1997, 98, we've researched it consistently and just published 3 studies, one of our research fellows here, about how kids under stress have much more sickness and they are more obese, etc. But it is this whole, the way our DNA, as we're growing as children, the way our DNA is read and transcribed, the gray and white matters in the brain, the whole way the body forms, it's in the state of stress of like, I'm in a stressful situation. I have to hold on to fat. My insulin is more resistant. So it changes your endocrine system. It changes everything. And again, are we as a church, we're addressing again the, smoking and vegetarianism, but we're not even talking about this, that if in your household there is a lot of fighting between the parents, if there's a mentally ill parent, if there is a parent who is using drugs or alcohol, those kids, their bodies are changed for life. We've got to take it seriously. And it's not just their bodies. I'm going to show you this little video. It's in Norwegian, but you can see what's happening. But it shows what happens to children's perceptions of life. And this happens also for people who live in chronic stress at home with a primary partner. They are changed with how they perceive the world.
Ikke noe farlig, vennen min. Mamma og pappa var bare litt uenige.
Mommy and Daddy are just a little in disagreement.
Går det bra?
He says, is it okay? Are you okay? And it says children who experience violence at home see the world a little different. And that is true. And that is true happening in Adventist homes all over, that kids and spouses are living with this overactivated system that God put in place for beautiful things, but that actually really changes their perception of the world. And so when you have a kid in a classroom in our Adventist schools who's maybe throwing chairs or very aggressive towards other kids, or you have a church member who you see is just always overreacting, or an office staff person who's struggling, we have to change how we're framing things and approach it differently, with an understanding that a lot of people are living in toxic stress, and it changes how they view everything. We see here, I'm just going to kind of illustrate, show you, and I see I'm running out of time. So I'm so bad at time management. I'm an optimist, so I always think, oh, I'll get through it. 80 slides for 20 minutes, no problem. I'm just kidding. But so you see everything, it goes through the entire, here we have maternal sensitivity, people who experience toxic stress, they're less able to be good moms. Men are jobless because they, and women too, because of that kind of stress. And I love this study here. I'm just going to mention it briefly. Oh yeah, here it also talks about aggressive behavior and sexual abuse. This all stems from animal cruelty. All of this stems from children who live in these very difficult homes. As I am researching now, and I'm in my PhD classes, it's so interesting. People are always coming up to me in the breaks, whatever they're researching, they'll be like, oh my goodness, you know what? A lot of my patients have had adverse childhood experiences. And I'm like, yeah, they sure have, because every health disease, I mean, every disease process you find is linked to adverse childhood experiences, pretty much. So the resilience factors are things that we have in our Adventist toolkit already. And it's just the first time I started reading, these can be called like anti-ACEs. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And now there's a new field that's developed called anti-ACEs, or resilience factors. And I read the list and I was like, that's the Adventist health message. Where are we? Where have we been? You know, just like when vegetarianism just like exploded here in Norway. And I was like, we should have made it more fun 10 years ago. Anyway, I'm sure we helped at some level, but these are the things. And I could come back and explain to you another time if people are interested. I would go into detail of all of these because they're all very exciting, and it's much more in depth. You know, there's so much research that shows why these are important that we as Adventists, I had at least never heard, and I've read all the Weimar stuff and all that. But I wanted to focus today on connection in closing. So connection is super important. I've already talked about secrets, but there's a study about rats and stress, and the rats that were licked often by their moms, basically hugs and kisses in human language, those rats were even into the second generation able to experience stress in a totally different way. They were not stressed as the other ones. And that connection that you can see down all the way to rats is crucial for us too. And if you can just reflect, like, what does that look like for us? What does connection look like? It's not easy when you are, again, a church leader, to be honest about what you may be going through, what you might be struggling with. But it is super important that we articulate the stress we're going to. There are studies that show when you talk about what it is that's hurting you or bothering you, it actually really changes how we react to stress framover, how we in the future, and the rest of the time we react much less. And just as these ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, all kind of are intertwined, so are these protective factors. And I wanted to mention Jesus and toxic stress, because from what I see, he was never afraid to face it head on with no shame. And the first quote that comes to mind is, you have 5 husbands. It's just like non-judgmental. You have 5 husbands. That's a lot of stress. The demoniac, not afraid at all to address that. Caught in adultery, not afraid. He never avoided the tough stuff. And he didn't seem to be particularly shaming about it. It was like, yeah, this happens. I mean, read the whole Bible. It's just depressing. It's tons of people struggling. And yet there's no fear. He chose to put that out there as what we could expect. And then he himself made sure he had connection, both with God and with the other people in his inner circle. He made sure he had not only Mary and Lazarus and Martha, but he made sure he had the broader circle of his disciples. Do you have those connections in your life? And are you creating those in your organization or your church? And those create meaning and purpose, and they open us up to the possibilities God has. Also, there's research that shows just putting like little post-its, see the one I made here, forgiven, all over, just to bring down that stress reaction. Every time you're like, oh, I was late. Why didn't I plan that better? Why did I snap like that? Forgiven, forgiven, forgiven. And this was from a non-Christian book. She's just saying, it's like, again, the non-Christians are sometimes getting this more than we are. And I love that about God. He will reach people wherever he is with his message, even when people don't know him at all. Jesus spent that time quietly with God. And I know it's easy for pastors or church workers to always be preparing for a sermon or a talk or a worship. But I hope that you guys are, one of the main things that combats toxic stress is meditation. It's in all the literature. Meditation is huge. Are we doing that? We have prayer. It's a beautiful thing. And then, of course, our other health principles. But I love this. Maya Angelou says, I've learned that people will forget what you said, especially from the pulpit. They will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. Are you connecting with the people around you? Do they sense that antidote to toxic stress of connection, that you really see them, that you really care? But again, you can't do that until you do it with yourself. And Jesus was so clear here. I'm sorry, I'm 1 minute over. I'm wrapping it up. But he said he was here for freedom for prisoners and for the oppressed. And that is what we are. And that is what our people are. All of, your interactions, I hope you'll remember, God is not afraid of the fact that we are prisoners and we are oppressed, but he's meeting us there, and he is addressing all of it, and he'll do it through us. So for a trauma-informed approach, it comes down to realizing and recognizing that it's there, these problems. And you guys will have my slides so you can read more in depth, but that we are responding. And I would love if the Adventist Church on every level, micro and macro, would implement some trauma-informed approaches. But again, we have to start in our own hearts. And we have to make sure that that we are not in a place of toxic stress ourselves, because he wants us to have life to the full. And to me, that looks like saying, I can let go of my secrets. I can let go of the fact that my life is messy, and then I can meet others in their mess too, because he's already met me there and I'm forgiven. So thank you guys so much. If anyone has questions or wants resources, these are my favorite books. I didn't get a chance to put the authors, but you'll have these slides again, and they're very compelling. Lots of health message. I see there's a chat. Any questions here? I'm just looking. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. So yeah, how does one heal? I love that question. I guess most of you need to leave, but I will just answer the best I can. How one heals is, it can be complex, but it can also, if you want to look at it, be very simple, in the sense that we know anti-ACEs, we know the antidotes are things that need to calm down that toxic stress. So those stress hormones that are constantly rushing through our body, we have to find ways to minimize those, and people can be healed. Number one, in all the research I can find, and my colleagues who are very wise, has been connection. You have safe people to talk to. You feel accepted no matter what you say. I am deeply embarrassed today because I have been lusting after this or that. I am deeply embarrassed because I have been a jerk. Whatever it is, I forgot a meeting, I wasn't prepared, and I look so incompetent. To be able to put those things out there to someone and be loved and accepted is a huge healing process. And isn't that at the heart of the gospel? But are we practicing it? Very often not. Another thing that can help is, again, all the Adventist health principles, that when we're exercising, it's huge. Like, again, I would love to come back sometime and tell you why our Adventist health principles actually work for toxic stress, because I didn't know it. I thought they were awesome before, and now I think they're so much better even. But implementing those not out of fear, not out of I should get healthy, but out of gratitude, living in a state of gratitude of, yes, life sucks and it's messy and it's hard, but God has provided ways. Thank you. And there are ways that make us feel so much better. And then, out of that flows our ministry, right? Out of that is where our witness comes. Any more questions?
Thank you so much, Mary Jo. It's been really good this morning. Thank you.